The Great War was a crucible in which the fate of empires was sealed, and Winston Churchill, despite the bitterness of hindsight, found his destiny irrevocably entwined with it. At the outbreak of World War I in 1914, Churchill was serving as First Lord of the Admiralty, a position that placed him at the very heart of Britain's military strategy. Though he had been a polarizing figure in British politics, his drive and ambition made him indispensable to the war effort. It was his vision for the Navy that shaped many of Britain's early moves in the conflict. His bold decision to prioritize the naval blockade of Germany, rather than an all-out offensive, showed his deep understanding of the economic as well as the military dimensions of warfare. However, Churchill's decisions were not without controversy. His support for the Gallipoli campaign, one of the most disastrous military misadventures of the war, would haunt his career for decades. The campaign was intended to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war by opening a new front through the Dardanelles. But the plan was marred by miscalculations, poor execution, and underestimation of the Turkish forces. The failure at Gallipoli resulted in tens of thousands of British, Australian, and New Zealand soldiers' deaths, and it marked a significant setback for Churchill, despite his impassioned efforts to salvage the operation. In the aftermath of Gallipoli, Churchill was forced to resign from his post. His critics were quick to seize on his failure, yet Churchill's resilience was unwavering. He accepted the blame for the campaign, but he never wavered in his belief that the war could be won if only Britain would fully mobilize its resources. After resigning from the Admiralty, he took up a new post in the Western Front, seeking to regain his reputation through action and steadfast dedication to the war effort. However, despite the failure at Gallipoli, Churchill's role in World War I was far from over. His later contributions, particularly his work in shaping British strategy on the Western Front, would have a lasting impact on the outcome of the war. Through all the setbacks and missteps, Churchill's legacy in World War I was ultimately defined by his vision for a more dynamic and mobile approach to modern warfare. His ideas on mechanized warfare and air power laid the groundwork for military innovation in the interwar years. Although the war would end with an armistice in 1918, the true cost of the conflict, both in human lives and global power shifts, had yet to be fully realized. For Churchill, the end of the war was merely a pause in a much larger struggle, one that would carry him into the next World War and forever define his place in history. As the war raged on, Churchill's role within the British government continued to evolve. By the time of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British Army had become bogged down in the trenches, and the brutality of warfare had reached new extremes. The horrors of trench warfare, with its incessant bombardments and waves of soldiers charging into machine gun fire, shattered the illusion of quick victory. Despite the devastating losses, Churchill remained adamant that Britain could still prevail. He understood that the war would not be won through traditional tactics, but through innovation, resourcefulness, and an unyielding belief in ultimate victory. His belief in technological innovation as the key to turning the tide of the war led to his support of the development of tanks. In 1916, Churchill took a keen interest in the new weapon that would come to symbolize the mechanization of warfare. The tank was still in its infancy, but Churchill's push for its development marked a turning point in military strategy. The British Army's initial deployment of tanks at the Battle of the Somme proved to be a failure, but Churchill's vision for their potential was undiminished. He saw tanks as a means to break the stalemate of trench warfare, a weapon that could overcome the mud, barbed wire, and entrenched positions that had paralyzed both sides for years. Yet, as the war dragged on, Churchill was confronted with growing political opposition. The failure of Gallipoli and the early setbacks in the war left him vulnerable to the criticism of his peers. The political infighting within the British government only intensified as the war progressed. Many of Churchill's contemporaries were disillusioned by the stalemate on the Western Front, and calls for a change in leadership grew louder. Churchill, however, remained steadfast. He saw the war not as an insurmountable disaster but as a challenge to be met with the full force of Britain's ingenuity and resolve. His persistence in pushing for the use of tanks and his efforts to modernize Britain's military infrastructure earned him a reputation as a forward-thinking, albeit controversial, figure in the war cabinet. Despite the political turmoil and public dissent, Churchill's contributions to the war effort during this period were instrumental in ensuring that Britain did not falter. His work on the development of tanks, his support for new strategies in air and naval warfare, and his continued belief in the importance of technological advancement helped lay the groundwork for future military victories. As the war reached its climax, Churchill's legacy as a military leader was solidified, even though the full fruits of his efforts would not be fully realized until after the war. By the time the war drew to a close in 1918, The impact of Churchill's efforts during the conflict could be seen in the changing nature of warfare. The tank, though not a decisive weapon during World War I, would become a cornerstone of military strategy in the years to come. Churchill's belief in mechanized warfare laid the foundation for the future use of tanks, airplanes, and other technological innovations in World War II. But his contributions to military strategy went beyond the battlefield. Churchill was also instrumental in shaping British political policy during the war. His role in the War Cabinet was pivotal, particularly during the critical moments when Britain's survival was in doubt. Churchill's ability to rally the government and the public, even when the war seemed to be going badly, was one of his most important achievements. His speeches, though often filled with a rhetoric of defiance and resolve, also spoke to the deeply emotional stakes of the conflict. Churchill's voice in Parliament, calling for unity and sacrifice, resonated with a nation struggling to cope with the horrors of war. He understood that Britain's strength lay not only in its military might but in the morale and determination of its people. Despite his failures and the setbacks he faced during the war, Churchill emerged from the conflict with a sense of vindication. His support for the tanks, his insistence on innovation, and his unrelenting belief in Britain's potential to overcome adversity marked him as one of the war's true visionaries. Yet, for all his success, Churchill's time in the First World War was not without personal cost. His political career was temporarily derailed by the Gallipoli disaster, and his reputation remained tarnished in the eyes of many. The war, for all its victories, was a crucible that tested not only the strength of nations but the endurance of individual leaders. As the war came to an end, Churchill found himself at a crossroads. His contributions to the war effort were undeniable, but the political fallout from Gallipoli remained a cloud over his career. Yet, Churchill's resilience in the face of failure, his ability to learn from his mistakes, and his unrelenting optimism ensured that his influence would be felt long after the guns fell silent. For Churchill, the First World War was not an end but a beginning. It was a trial by fire that forged his resolve and shaped his vision for the future. As Europe lay in ruins, Churchill's determination to rebuild and reshape the world order would soon find a new stage upon which to play out. The aftermath of World War I left Europe in a state of disarray, with entire empires in ruin and millions of lives lost. As the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, Winston Churchill found himself in a complex and difficult position. The war had reshaped global power dynamics, and while Britain emerged victorious, its costs were staggering. Churchill, no longer a central figure in the government, was relegated to the political wilderness. The scars of Gallipoli were still fresh, and many in the political establishment doubted his judgment. Yet even as Britain's focus shifted toward rebuilding, Churchill's mind never truly left the battlefield. His time away from the front lines of politics allowed him to reflect on the lessons of the war. His belief that Britain needed to modernize its military, and his deepening conviction in the power of technology, shaped his thoughts on the future of warfare. He came to the realization that the world was entering a new era, one in which mechanized warfare, air power, and technological innovation would dictate the outcome of future conflicts. While the aftermath of the war provided some moments of respite, Churchill knew that another conflict, potentially even more destructive, was not far off. Churchill's analysis of the treaty and his discontent with the post-war settlement was a precursor to his later efforts to warn the world of the dangers posed by totalitarianism. He was one of the few to recognize the weakness of the League of Nations and the folly of appeasement. His early advocacy for rearmament, and his criticisms of the Versailles Treaty, set the stage for his later political struggles and his return to the political center stage. Though the world had turned its attention to rebuilding after the war, Churchill was already watching the horizon, knowing full well that Europe's peace would be fragile at best. In the years following the war, Churchill would frequently find himself on the sidelines of British politics, but this period of reflection did not silence his voice. He had seen firsthand the political inertia and indecisiveness of leaders in the face of crisis, and he would not make the same mistake again. His time in the wilderness was not wasted. Churchill's writings, speeches, and correspondence during these years would serve as the foundation for his return to power in the 1930s, when the world faced yet another existential threat in the form of Adolf Hitler. But in the post-war years, Churchill's voice was quiet, even though his mind was working overtime, envisioning the future and the challenges it would bring. As Europe moved into the 1920s and 1930s, Churchill's warnings about the dangers of a second global conflict were once again ignored. The world was tired of war. The devastation of World War I left an indelible mark on the global psyche, and many leaders were determined to avoid another catastrophic conflict. Churchill, however, saw the rise of new threats, even as Britain was preoccupied with rebuilding and recovering from the war's toll. It was in the late 1920s and early 1930s that Churchill, watching the developments on the European continent, recognized the rise of a new type of threat: fascism. Fascist regimes were growing stronger in Europe, and while many dismissed these movements as a passing phenomenon, Churchill understood that their ideology was not only dangerous but expansive. He was alarmed by the rise of Mussolini in Italy and the growing influence of Adolf Hitler in Germany. He saw in their rhetoric a pattern he had recognized before, one that led to the aggressive nationalism that had fueled the First World War. Yet again Churchill found himself isolated, warning of a storm that others refused to acknowledge. In 1934 he began speaking out against the spread of fascism, particularly Hitler's ambitions, but his calls went largely unheeded. The political atmosphere of Britain in the interwar years was one of complacency and denial. Many of Churchill's contemporaries, particularly in the ruling Conservative Party, were content with the status quo. They believed that the economic depression of the early 1930s would naturally lead to international cooperation and peace. Churchill, on the other hand, was increasingly vocal in his criticism of British appeasement and the weakness of the League of Nations. He understood that the failure to stand up to fascism in its infancy would lead to global conflict. In the years leading up to the outbreak of World War II, Churchill's advocacy for military preparedness was often mocked. The British government and the public were desperate to avoid another war. Appeasement, led by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, was the prevailing policy. Churchill was one of the few voices in the wilderness, warning that the rising threats in Germany, Italy, and Japan could not be wished away. He was convinced that rearmament was necessary if Britain was to survive the coming storm, but the majority of his colleagues were convinced that a peaceful settlement could be negotiated. Churchill's warnings once again fell on deaf ears. Yet, despite his political isolation, Churchill continued to prepare himself for a future role in the defense of Britain. He wrote extensively, attended military briefings, and kept his ear to the ground about the developments in Europe. His experiences during the First World War, especially the failures of leadership that he had witnessed, gave him a unique perspective on how to handle the growing threat of another world conflict. He knew that Britain could not afford to make the same mistakes again. The political storm finally broke in 1939. The world that Churchill had been warning about was no longer distant or hypothetical, it was upon them. When Adolf Hitler invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Britain and France declared war, and the world was plunged into the second great conflict of the 20th century. Churchill, having spent years advocating for military readiness and speaking out against appeasement, was finally vindicated. His warnings, though long ignored, now rang true. In the days leading up to the outbreak of war, Churchill's influence grew. He was recalled to his former position as First Lord of the Admiralty, and the British government, which had once dismissed him, now needed him to help lead the country through the crisis. Churchill's vision of a new and more dynamic warfare had become a reality, and he quickly turned his attention to Britain's naval and air defense. His experience in World War I, where he had been instrumental in the development of naval strategies, made him uniquely qualified for this task. Churchill's early days in office were marked by a sense of urgency and determination. He knew that Britain was outmatched in many ways, but he also understood that the will to fight could make all the difference. His speeches, full of defiance and determination, inspired a nation on the brink of despair. "We shall never surrender," he famously declared, rallying the British people to face down the growing threat of Nazi Germany. Churchill's resilience and foresight had prepared him for this moment, and now, as the leader of Britain in its darkest hour, he would become the symbol of the nation's resolve. As the war unfolded, Churchill's leadership became a beacon of hope for Britain. The war was brutal and the cost of resistance was high, but Churchill's voice never wavered. In the face of German bombings, military setbacks, and the seemingly insurmountable odds, Churchill's steady resolve kept Britain's spirit intact. His understanding of the human element of warfare, how leadership, morale, and resilience could tip the scales, was what made him the leader the nation needed. For all the tragedy of war, Churchill's determination to win, and his belief in Britain's ultimate triumph, provided the lifeline the country clung to during its darkest days. In those early days of the war, Churchill's words did not simply serve as a rallying cry, they were a direct response to the failures of the past. They were a recognition of the cost of appeasement and of the failure to heed the warnings that had come before. Churchill understood that the war Britain faced now was the culmination of all the missteps, the underestimation of evil, and the refusal to act when action was still possible. His role in the First World War, his battles in the political wilderness, and his foresight in the years leading up to the second conflict had all converged. He was prepared for this fight in every sense. The path that led Winston Churchill to the role he would play in the Second World War was long, arduous, and often isolated. His experiences during the First World War, the disappointments of Gallipoli, his personal struggles, and the subsequent political exile, shaped his views and forged a determination that would later become his trademark. Churchill learned in those early years that foresight, no matter how accurate, was worthless unless accompanied by action. He learned the value of resilience and the cost of complacency. As Britain stood alone against the Nazi onslaught, Churchill's experience from the First World War, particularly his knowledge of warfare's strategic and technological aspects, was vital. He understood the importance of not just the army, but also the Navy, Air Force, and the civilian resolve of the British people. His appreciation for technological advancements, such as the early use of tanks, which he had championed in the First World War, directly influenced Britain's defense strategy in the Second World War. Churchill's leadership during these years was a testament to the lessons learned in the crucible of the First World War and the mistakes that had been made in the years following. For Churchill, the Second World War was not a new chapter, but a continuation of a struggle he had been warning against for decades. His efforts during the First World War, particularly his push for innovation in military technology, had laid the groundwork for the strategies and tactics that would be used to defeat Nazi Germany. His understanding of the global balance of power, the need for Britain to act decisively and with foresight, made him the right leader at the right time. Though his journey had been one of setbacks and failure, Churchill's preparation, resolve, and vision would ultimately help Britain and its allies secure victory. As the war raged on through 1940 and into 1941, Churchill's role as Britain's unshakable leader was solidified. The dark shadow of German aggression loomed large over Europe, and Britain stood alone, its empire struggling to survive the relentless blitzkrieg. The war had become not only a test of military might but of national endurance. Yet Churchill's steadfast leadership became the backbone of Britain's resistance. His understanding of the costs of delay, shaped by his years of political isolation and the bitter lessons of the First World War, gave him an unmatched clarity. Unlike his predecessors who had allowed appeasement to guide their diplomacy, Churchill's voice rang clear: Britain must fight no matter the cost. Throughout the Blitz, when London was bombed night after night, Churchill's presence was a constant source of morale for the people. His refusal to be daunted by the German bombers, his habit of visiting the bombed sites, and his frequent speeches rallied the spirits of the British public. He famously proclaimed, "We shall never surrender," a line that became synonymous with his leadership. His voice, filled with defiance, spoke not just of military strategy but of Britain's soul, of a nation that refused to bow to tyranny, no matter how overwhelming the odds. Churchill's early experience in World War I, particularly his understanding of the value of naval and aerial power, translated directly into the strategies that Britain employed to hold off Hitler. His aggressive stance on securing and improving the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain was a direct extension of his wartime philosophy. Churchill had witnessed firsthand how innovation and preparation could make all the difference on the battlefield. In this case, it was the fighters in the skies that gave Britain the advantage, and Churchill's commitment to ensuring their strength was pivotal. He had come full circle from the early failures of Gallipoli, now using every tool available to him to secure Britain's survival. But even as Britain stood firm against the German onslaught, Churchill knew that the fight was far from over. His relationship with other world leaders, particularly with President Franklin D. Roosevelt of the United States, would become crucial in securing the support needed to turn the tide. During the darkest days of 1940 and 1941, Churchill's diplomatic efforts were as vital as his military strategy. He understood that victory would require not just British resilience, but the full mobilization of global resources and alliances. Churchill's ability to inspire and negotiate with the Americans marked a significant shift in the war's dynamic, as it solidified the Atlantic alliance that would prove to be a decisive force in the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. As 1941 unfolded, the battle for the survival of Britain was far from won. The scale of the conflict, the immensity of the losses, and the relentless pressure on the civilian population tested the very limits of Churchill's leadership. Yet his vision of ultimate victory remained unwavering. In the face of growing opposition from those who wanted to pursue peace at any cost, Churchill's resolve never wavered. He saw the long-term consequences of appeasement, which he had fought against so vigorously during the interwar years. To him, the only way forward was victory, and that meant standing firm against tyranny at all costs. As the war raged on through 1940 and into 1941, Churchill's role as Britain's unshakable leader was solidified. The dark shadow of German aggression loomed large over Europe, and Britain stood alone, its empire struggling to survive the relentless blitzkrieg. The war had become not only a test of military might but of national endurance. Yet Churchill's steadfast leadership became the backbone of Britain's resistance. His understanding of the costs of delay, shaped by his years of political isolation and the bitter lessons of the First World War, gave him an unmatched clarity. Unlike his predecessors who had allowed appeasement to guide their diplomacy, Churchill's voice rang clear: Britain must fight no matter the cost. Throughout the Blitz, when London was bombed night after night, Churchill's presence was a constant source of morale for the people. His refusal to be daunted by the German bombers, his habit of visiting the bombed sites, and his frequent speeches rallied the spirits of the British public. He famously proclaimed, "We shall never surrender," a line that became synonymous with his leadership. His voice, filled with defiance, spoke not just of military strategy but of Britain's soul, of a nation that refused to bow to tyranny, no matter how overwhelming the odds. Churchill's early experience in World War I, particularly his understanding of the value of naval and aerial power, translated directly into the strategies that Britain employed to hold off Hitler. His aggressive stance on securing and improving the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain was a direct extension of his wartime philosophy. Churchill had witnessed firsthand how innovation and preparation could make all the difference on the battlefield. In this case, it was the fighters in the skies that gave Britain the advantage, and Churchill's commitment to ensuring their strength was pivotal. He had come full circle from the early failures of Gallipoli, now using every tool available to him to secure Britain's survival. But even as Britain stood firm against the German onslaught, Churchill knew that the fight was far from over. His relationship with other world leaders, particularly with President Franklin D. Roosevelt of the United States, would become crucial in securing the support needed to turn the tide. During the darkest days of 1940 and 1941, Churchill's diplomatic efforts were as vital as his military strategy. He understood that victory would require not just British resilience, but the full mobilization of global resources and alliances. Churchill's ability to inspire and negotiate with the Americans marked a significant shift in the war's dynamic, as it solidified the Atlantic alliance that would prove to be a decisive force in the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. As 1941 unfolded, the battle for the survival of Britain was far from won. The scale of the conflict, the immensity of the losses, and the relentless pressure on the civilian population tested the very limits of Churchill's leadership. Yet his vision of ultimate victory remained unwavering. In the face of growing opposition from those who wanted to pursue peace at any cost, Churchill's resolve never wavered. He saw the long-term consequences of appeasement, which he had fought against so vigorously during the interwar years. To him, the only way forward was victory, and that meant standing firm against tyranny at all costs. The turning point of the war came in 1942, with the successful Allied campaigns in North Africa and the Battle of Stalingrad in the Soviet Union. These victories, though hard-fought, began to shift the momentum in favor of the Allies. Churchill's relentless pursuit of victory, coupled with his ability to rally the Allies, ensured that Britain remained at the heart of the war effort. However, as the war entered its later stages, Churchill was increasingly confronted with the reality of post-war reconstruction. While victory seemed inevitable, the future of Europe was uncertain, and the question of Britain's place in the world after the war loomed large. For Churchill, the victory over Nazi Germany was only part of the struggle. His vision for the post-war world was one of continued British influence, particularly through the preservation of the empire. But the world was changing, and many of his wartime allies, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, were focused on a new world order, one that did not necessarily align with Britain's imperial ambitions. As the war drew to a close, Churchill found himself navigating the delicate balance between maintaining British power and accommodating the changing geopolitical landscape. The Yalta Conference in 1945 marked a pivotal moment in Churchill's career. There, he met with Roosevelt and Stalin to discuss the post-war settlement. While Churchill's diplomatic skills were on full display, he also had to contend with the reality of Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe. The agreements made at Yalta would later come to define the Cold War and the division of Europe. Churchill, while working to secure British interests, had to confront the rise of Soviet power in a way that would shape his thinking for the rest of his life. The war may have been won, but the peace that followed was uncertain. For Churchill, the end of World War II did not bring an end to his leadership in Britain. His legacy was solidified, but the challenges of post-war recovery loomed large. Despite his victory in the war, Churchill lost the 1945 general election, and his time in office came to an end. But even as he stepped down from the prime ministership, his role as a global statesman remained significant. His speeches about the dangers of Soviet totalitarianism, particularly his Iron Curtain speech in 1946, signaled the beginning of the Cold War, as Churchill once again warned the world of the dangers of complacency. Churchill's return to power in 1951, though brief, was marked by a world that had changed irrevocably. The post-war order was now dominated by two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, and Britain's place in the world was no longer what it once had been. The days of the British Empire were numbered, and Churchill, ever the realist, knew that the future of Britain lay not in its imperial past, but in its ability to navigate the complexities of the new global order. Though he remained a powerful figure in British politics, his focus was now on ensuring that Britain maintained its influence in a world that was increasingly dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union. Churchill's final years were marked by reflection and contemplation. He had been at the center of two world wars, shaped the destiny of nations and witnessed the rise and fall of empires. But as his health began to decline, Churchill knew that his time was running out. His legacy, however, would endure. He had seen the darkness of the 20th century, two world wars, the rise of totalitarian regimes and the collapse of empires, and had steered Britain through it all with unparalleled resolve. In his final speeches and writings, Churchill continued to advocate for vigilance and preparedness. Even as Britain's imperial influence waned, Churchill remained steadfast in his belief that the world needed strong leadership to confront emerging challenges. His warning about the dangers of complacency, which had served him so well during the rise of Nazi Germany, remained relevant as the world faced the complexities of the Cold War. Churchill's death in 1965 marked the end of an era, but his legacy as a leader who saw the world clearly and acted decisively in its darkest hours would live on. His life was a testament to the power of conviction, the importance of foresight, and the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. In the end, Winston Churchill's greatest gift to the world was not his triumphs in battle, but his unshakable belief in the value of freedom, democracy, and the necessity of standing firm against the forces of tyranny. In the years following Churchill's death, the world continued to grapple with the profound legacy he had left behind. As Britain and the broader international community entered the post-World War II era, the weight of Churchill's vision was felt in ways both direct and indirect. He had been a symbol of hope and determination during the war, but as the world shifted toward the Cold War and the emergence of new global powers, his leadership continued to cast a long shadow over British foreign policy. Even as the old British Empire receded into history, Churchill's influence remained essential in shaping the course of world events. Churchill's warnings about the dangers of unchecked aggression had transcended the rise of fascism in the 1930s. His foresight had extended far beyond Hitler's Germany, and he became a central figure in addressing the new ideological battles that dominated the post-war world. The onset of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, with its ideological divide between democracy and communism, was a direct reflection of the geopolitical tensions Churchill had recognized even before the war had ended. His speeches, particularly the Iron Curtain speech delivered in 1946, marked the beginning of the long struggle between the capitalist West and the communist East. Churchill had understood the nature of totalitarianism in its various forms and even as his health declined, continued to advocate for vigilance in defending the principles of democracy and freedom. Despite his retirement from active political leadership, Churchill's voice remained relevant on the world stage. He continued to participate in discussions about the future of Europe, the restructuring of post-war economies, and the nature of Britain's role in the New World Order. Though no longer Prime Minister, his political career was a constant reminder to both allies and adversaries of the importance of leadership that combined moral clarity with political pragmatism. Churchill's role as a strategist, a historian, and a leader whose understanding of history shaped his actions remained at the heart of Britain's diplomatic efforts as it faced the challenges of a changing global landscape. The period of relative peace after World War II was not without its tensions. Churchill's work on the global stage, particularly during the final years of his life, had shown the difficulties of balancing power politics with the idealistic ambitions of peace and security. His life had been defined by two global wars, but it was in the aftermath of these conflicts that his most enduring lessons would find their greatest relevance. The post-war world was a testament to the fragility of peace and the importance of leadership in moments of uncertainty. Churchill's later years were marked by deep reflection on his legacy and the lessons of his long and tumultuous career. He had lived through two world wars, witnessed the fall of empires and seen the reshaping of the global order. The contradictions of his life, his belief in empire alongside his advocacy for international cooperation, his unwavering support for Britain's strength alongside his vision for European unity, highlighted the complexities of his worldview. His personal life, too, was a reflection of the challenges he faced in reconciling the demands of leadership with the toll it took on his health and family. His writings from this period reveal a man who, though at peace with his achievements, remained haunted by the knowledge that history had often judged him harshly. The personal sacrifices he had made, particularly his periods of political exile and the toll that his military failures had taken on his reputation, were never far from his mind. Yet, despite the occasional bitterness and the recognition that his health was deteriorating, Churchill continued to push forward, confident in the knowledge that history would one day recognize the true scope of his contribution. In his final years, Churchill's writings became more introspective. His thoughts turned to the lessons of war, the importance of vigilance in preserving peace, and the role that individuals could play in shaping the course of history. He believed that each generation was responsible for passing down the lessons of the past, ensuring that the mistakes of earlier times would not be repeated. His emphasis on the cyclical nature of history, the importance of understanding its patterns, and the role of leaders in guiding their nations through tumultuous periods became central to his philosophy. Churchill's death in 1965 at the age of 90 marked the end of an era. His passing was a moment of national mourning, but it also signaled the closing of a chapter in British history. The world he had shaped through his leadership in the two world wars was gone, and in its place was a new global order. Yet, despite the changes, Churchill's legacy remained indelible. His belief in the importance of freedom, democracy, and the necessity of strong leadership to defend those values had left an enduring imprint on history. As the years passed following Churchill's death, his influence continued to resonate across generations. His speeches, writings, and actions during the Second World War, and his leadership in navigating the post-war world, cemented his place as one of the 20th century's most significant statesmen. His legacy was not just in the victories achieved on the battlefield, but in the moral clarity with which he faced the crises of his time. In the years following his death, historians and political leaders often looked back on Churchill's leadership with a renewed sense of admiration. His wartime speeches, his calls to arms, and his determination in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds became an enduring source of inspiration. But it was Churchill's understanding of the importance of history, his ability to see beyond the present and anticipate the future, that truly set him apart. His warnings about the dangers of complacency, the rise of totalitarianism, and the fragility of peace remained as relevant in the post-war world as they had been during the dark days of the 1930s. Churchill's story is ultimately one of foresight and conviction. He saw the dangers that others refused to acknowledge, and he acted decisively in the face of overwhelming odds. His life was a testament to the power of leadership, the value of resilience, and the importance of standing firm in the face of tyranny. As the world continued to face new challenges in the decades after his death, Churchill's legacy lived on, not just as a memory of past triumphs, but as a reminder of the enduring struggle to protect the freedoms that define the modern world. In the final analysis, Winston Churchill's life and career teach us that history is shaped by those who are willing to stand alone in the face of adversity, to speak truth when others turn away, and to lead with unwavering conviction in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. His legacy endures not only in the pages of history but in the ideals he fought for, ideals that continue to guide us in the ongoing struggle for freedom and justice across the globe.